Through the corridors of the Shelby County Courthouse in 1968, these words echoed when the case of the Harmon family came to light. The most incestuous patriarch of Alabama had impregnated mother, daughter, and sister all within the same house. The revelation uncovered one of the most disturbing stories of consanguinity in modern American history. South of Birmingham, Alabama, in the dense hills far from the urban bustle of the 1960s, lay an almost inaccessible property. For at least 4 generations, a faded wooden house built at the beginning of the century had sheltered the Harmon family. The isolation was not just geographic. It was genetic and cultural as well. To a report about children living in precarious conditions, social worker Thomas Wheeler and Deputy Sheriff Robert Collins responded on the cold morning of November 23, 1968. After navigating narrow paths for almost an hour, they reached the clearing where the main house stood. At first glance, the property seemed abandoned, a 2-story house with its white paint almost completely peeled off, which revealed the rotten wood underneath. Rusty tools, car parts, and debris accumulated in the yard. Among the debris, skinny chickens pecked, and a skeletal dog was chained to a post. When they knocked, Elmer Harmon, a man of approximately 50 years with a much older appearance, greeted them. Tall and thin, with hunched shoulders and a suspicious look, he reluctantly allowed them to enter. Even worse conditions were revealed by the interior. The air was permeated by the smell of mold and urine. In the main room, a fragile-looking woman, no more than 35 years old, was cradling a newborn baby. Elmer introduced her as his wife, Mary. Then Wheeler noticed another woman, appearing to be about 70 years old, sitting in a rocking chair. Elmer introduced her as his mother, Martha Harmon. Most disturbing, however, was that Martha was also cradling a baby, apparently just a few months old. "And who is this baby?" Wheeler asked. "He's my son," Martha replied without any trace of shame. As they talked, a young girl of approximately 16 years came down the stairs carrying another baby. The teenager had facial features that suggested genetic abnormalities, widely spaced eyes, a receded chin, and low-set ears. "This is my daughter, Ruth," said Elma with a tone that mixed pride and possessiveness. "And this is her baby." Something deeply disturbing was realized by Wheeler. 3 generations of women, all with babies. When Collins directly asked who the father of these children was, Elma's response shocked them both. "They're mine," he answered defiantly. "They're all my children. This is my family, and no one has anything to do with it." To maintaining consanguineous relations with his own mother, wife, and daughter, Elmer Harmon had just admitted, and he was the father of all 3 recently born babies. "The laws of God and men don't apply here," Elmer continued. "We are a special family. For generations, we've kept our blood pure." Within hours, the Harmon property would be surrounded by authorities, and an investigation would begin to reveal the horrors hiding behind those time-worn walls. Just beginning to unfold was the story of Elmer Harmon, the man who impregnated his mother, wife, and daughter, revealing a genetic and social nightmare that spanned nearly a century of isolation and forbidden practices. Check if you're already subscribed to this channel. You won't want to miss any details of this real story that exposes the devastating consequences of isolation and consanguinity in American families. Subscribe now to access the next chapters of this impactful investigation that will change your view on the hidden history of the American South. The story of the Harmon family didn't begin with Elmer. The roots of that consanguineous lineage dated back to the American Civil War when Jeremiah Harmon, Elmer's great-grandfather, settled in that remote region of Alabama after deserting from the Confederate Army in 1863. A violent and paranoid man, Jeremiah chose that isolated location to avoid authorities. With him came his young wife, his sister, and 2 cousins, the original nucleus that would give rise to one of the most genetically closed lineages in modern American history. When authorities began investigating Elmer's case in 1968, they discovered diaries written by various members of the Harmon family across generations. A disturbing ideology that developed in isolation was revealed by these documents. An excerpt from the diary of Frederick Harmon, Elmer's father, written in 1932, said, we keep our blood clean while the world out there corrupts itself. Each Harmon generation is stronger than the previous one. Weak children don't survive. Only the strong remain. It's the law of nature. This distorted thinking originated with Jeremiah and was passed down as a sacred tradition. Without external interference for more than a century, the extreme isolation allowed these practices to continue. One of the rare external additions to the Harmon lineage was Mary, Elmer's wife. Born in an impoverished rural community about 30 miles away, she met Elmer during an agricultural fair in 1952. At only 16 years old, Mary saw an opportunity to escape the misery of her own family in Elmer, then 34. A reality very different from what was promised was discovered by Mary upon arriving at the Harmon property. The house was in ruins. The land barely produced enough food. And she quickly realized that something was deeply disturbing in the relationships between Elmer and the other family members, especially his mother. When Martha first became pregnant by Elmer, Mary tried to escape. Before reaching the main road, she was captured and kept chained in the barn for weeks. This escape attempt marked the beginning of a period of psychological and physical captivity that would last more than 15 years. The Harmon case represents an extreme example of how geographic isolation can lead to genetic isolation, explained Dr. Richard Thompson, a geneticist who studied the family. When a population remains isolated for generations and consistently practices consanguinity, we see a gradual collapse of genetic diversity, leading to a concentration of harmful recessive mutations. In Elmer's generation, this concentration of recessive genes began to show its devastating effects. Of the 8 children his mother, Martha, had, only 3 survived to adulthood. The others died from various congenital complications. Evident signs of genetic collapse were shown by Ruth, Elmer, and Mary's teenage daughter. In addition to distinctive facial features, she had severe scoliosis, fused fingers on both hands, and significant cognitive delays. During the investigation, an improvised cemetery was found by authorities at the back of the property. Small wooden crosses, many already rotted by time, marked the graves of dozens of Harmon children who didn't survive. Some graves had only numbers engraved in the wood, without names or dates. An elaborate belief system to justify their practices was maintained by the family. They didn't see consanguinity as wrong or harmful, but as a way to preserve what they called the Harmon essence, an almost mystical concept of family purity that transcended common laws. The investigation further revealed that Elmer wasn't the first in his lineage to maintain relations with multiple generations of the family simultaneously. His own grandfather, Isaiah Harmon, had followed a similar pattern, having children with his mother, sister, and 2 daughters. On December 12, 1968, 3 weeks after the initial discovery, a coordinated operation between social services, law enforcement, and medical teams took place. The objective was to remove all vulnerable family members and transport them to facilities where they could receive adequate care. Contrary to the authorities' fears, there was no armed resistance. Sitting on the porch, seemingly resigned, Elmer was found. "You've come to destroy something you can't understand," were his first words to Sheriff Tanner. 100 years of Harmon history ends today. Inside the house, an even more disturbing situation than initially reported was found by the medical teams. Besides Martha, Mary, and Ruth with their respective babies, 2 more teenage sons of Elmer and Mary were discovered hidden in the attic, 14-year-old twins who showed evident signs of malnutrition and serious developmental problems. It was like entering a museum of horrors of human genetics, reported Dr. Elizabeth Carter, a pediatrician who was part of the medical team. Every person in that house carried visible marks of generations of consanguinity. A slow and delicate process was the removal of the family members. Martha, despite her age, proved surprisingly lucid. "You think you're saving us," she said, "but you're just separating what God has joined together. The Harmons are special. We always have been." Evident relief was shown by Mary when she understood that she would be taken far from that property. In a moment of privacy with a social worker, she whispered, "Please don't let him find us again. He'll kill us all if that happens." Unable to fully understand what was happening, Ruth, the teenage daughter, seemed. Clinging to her baby, she rocked her body back and forth, repeating, "Daddy comes back. Daddy always comes back. We're special. We're Harmon." In the days that followed, the magnitude of the Harmon case began to reveal itself through detailed medical examinations. The twins, Jacob and Joseph, presented a clinical picture that shocked even the most experienced doctors. Both had a rare condition called phocomelia, characterized by abnormal development of the limbs, which were extremely short and deformed. They also shared severe intellectual disability and congenital heart problems. Ruth, at 16 years old, showed signs of premature aging with severe arthritis in her hands and spine. Her baby, born from the union with her own father, was diagnosed with multiple genetic conditions, including Apert syndrome, characterized by premature fusion of the skull bones and severe facial anomalies. Multiple cardiac malformations were presented by Martha's baby, which doctors predicted would be fatal within a few months. The child would die in February 1969, confirming the somber medical prognosis. During psychological evaluations, a disturbing pattern of mental conditioning emerged. The women and children had been indoctrinated with a worldview where consanguinity was not just acceptable but desirable, a sacred duty to preserve the Harmon essence. The only voice of resistance within that closed system was represented by Mary. During her sessions with psychologists, she revealed how she had tried to protect her children from Elmer. "I knew it was wrong. I always knew," Mary confessed. "I tried to escape with the children 3 times. They always found us. The last time he broke my leg as punishment." As the investigation progressed, a complex challenge was faced by prosecutors. How to present a case that defied common understanding. How to explain the evolution of a family lineage that had developed a belief system normalizing universally condemned practices. Fragments of the story were eventually captured by the local press. The first reports were cautious and vague, but as details began to leak, the story gained national attention. To protect the victim's privacy, the authorities obtained a court order restricting coverage of the case. Meanwhile, in the county jail, Elmer Harmon showed himself to be surprisingly calm and cooperative. During interrogations, he spoke openly about his practices and beliefs without showing any sign of remorse or understanding that he had done something wrong. "You don't understand because you're not Harmon," he frequently repeated to investigators. "Our lineage has a greater purpose. Each generation brings us closer to perfection. The children who don't survive are just the weak branches being pruned." When you realize the gravity of this case, it's impossible not to feel a mix of horror and compassion for the victims. If this account touched your heart, leave in the comments, "May justice be done for the victims of the Harmons." Your voice matters to keep alive the memory of these people who suffered in silence for so many generations. On March 17, 1969, in the Shelby County Courthouse, the trial of Elmer Harmon began. Despite restrictions on press coverage, the case had generated so much interest that local citizens began forming lines before dawn to secure a place in the audience. Judge Harold Montgomery warned the jury that they were about to hear testimonies that would challenge their understanding of the depths of human depravity and asked them to maintain objectivity despite the shock they would certainly feel. A powerful statement opened the trial from the prosecution, led by Jonathan Reynolds. "This is not just the trial of a man. It is the trial of an entire system. A system that transformed a family into a perverse genetic experiment where children were born condemned to lives of suffering. Where women were reduced to mere vessels to perpetuate a sick lineage." In the hands of Theodore Barnes, a court-appointed lawyer, was Elmer's defense. The only strategy he considered viable was adopted by Barnes, arguing that Elmer, a product of generations of isolation and consanguinity, did not possess the mental capacity to understand the criminal nature of his actions. This line of defense was vigorously rebutted by prosecutor Reynolds. Elmer Harmon was not isolated from reality to the point of not understanding the nature of his acts. He interacted with the outside world when it suited him. He consciously chose to hide certain practices because deep down he knew they were condemnable. The most impactful moment came on the fourth day with Mary Harmon's testimony, transmitted by closed-circuit television. "I was 16 when I met Elmer," she began. "He promised me a better life, said he had land, a big house, that we would never want for anything." Mary described her arrival at the Harmon property and the gradual understanding of the nightmare she had entered. She talked about her first escape attempt when she discovered that Martha was pregnant by Elmer. "He dragged me back by my hair. I spent 3 weeks chained in the barn in the cold." The most devastating moment came when Mary described how Elmer justified his actions. "He said it was our purpose, that the Harmons had special blood that needed to be kept pure. When children were born with problems and died, he said it was because they weren't true Harmons, that it was nature eliminating the weak." During cross-examination, the defense attorney tried to suggest that Mary had also been conditioned to accept these practices over time. Her response would become one of the most remembered quotes from the case. "Every day of those 16 years, I thought about running away. Every day, I thought about killing Elmer while he slept. Every day I dreamed of someone coming to rescue us. I survived because I had children to protect. If that makes me an accomplice in your eyes, may God have mercy on your soul because you don't understand what it's like to live in hell." Context about how isolated communities can develop radically divergent belief systems and the biological consequences of prolonged consanguinity was provided by experts in psychology, anthropology, and genetics. On the 10th day of the trial, against his lawyer's advice, Elmer Harmon took the witness stand. "I am the guardian of the Harmon lineage," were his first words to the jury. "What you call crime, we call sacred duty. My great-grandfather Jeremiah saw the future. He saw that the world would become impure, that lineages would mix until nothing of value remained. The Harmons are the last bearers of true blood." During cross-examination, Reynolds led Elmer to admit that he maintained regular contact with the outside world when necessary and that he deliberately concealed certain practices because he knew they would be condemned. "So," concluded Reynolds, "you knew that society considered your actions wrong, but you decided you were above these laws. This isn't delusion, Mr. Harmon. This is criminal arrogance." After 6 hours of deliberation, the jury returned with the verdict, guilty on all charges. 2 weeks later, Judge Montgomery pronounced the sentence, multiple consecutive penalties totaling 197 years in prison. Upon hearing the sentence, Elmer remained impassive. His last words recorded in court were directed at Prosecutor Reynolds, "You think you ended the Harmon lineage today, but we are like seeds in the wind. Some always find fertile soil. One day you will understand." The trial and conviction of Elmer Harmon in 1969 did not end the family's story. It only opened a new chapter marked by scientific discoveries and consequences that would extend for generations. After the trial, Elmer's direct victims were sent to different institutions. Martha died in 1972 in a long-term care facility. Mary, after extensive counseling, managed to partially rebuild her life under a new identity. The twins, Jacob and Joseph, were placed in a specialized institution. Ruth was sent to a rehabilitation program aimed at young people with special needs. The surviving babies were adopted by carefully selected families. In 1975, approval for a longitudinal study of the surviving members of the Harmon family was obtained by Dr. Richard Thompson. The Harmon Project began to systematically document the genetic consequences of 4 generations of consanguineous marriages. What we learned transformed our understanding of how extreme inbreeding affects the human genome, explained Thompson years later. The preliminary findings identified multiple rare recessive genes that appeared with alarming frequency in the Harmon lineage. Particularly significant was the discovery of a rare metabolic condition later termed Thompson-Harmon syndrome, characterized by an enzymatic deficiency that affects the metabolism of certain amino acids. This condition was present in almost 40% of the studied Harmon descendants. The studies also revealed that the Harmon lineage had branched out more than originally thought. During the period between 1880 and 1920, several young men from the family had left the main property to establish their own branches in other isolated areas. We identified at least 3 small isolated communities in rural areas of Alabama, Mississippi, and Tennessee where direct descendants of Jeremiah Harmon established themselves, revealed anthropologist Dr. James Peterson. These communities did not practice consanguinity as extreme as Elmer's branch, but still maintained significant genetic isolation. In 1988, researchers identified a woman of approximately 30 years with facial features typical of the Harmon lineage. Genetic tests confirmed she was Elmer's biological daughter, conceived before his arrest. Her biological mother was a temporary worker on the Harmon property who fled and later gave the child up for adoption. This woman, identified only as subject AG 47, had grown up in a normal environment with adequate nutrition and access to education and medical care. Surprisingly, she demonstrated fewer health problems than other direct descendants of Elmer, although she still presented certain distinctive genetic characteristics. AG47's case shows us how environment can partially mitigate even severe genetic predispositions, concluded Thompson. It's a powerful reminder of the complex interaction between nature and nurture. In 1992, with new genetic sequencing techniques, a specific group of mutations they called the Harmon signature was identified by researchers, a unique combination of genetic variants that produced a characteristic set of physical and neurological conditions. They identified at least 14 specific mutations that in combination produced the phenotype repeatedly observed in Elmer's direct descendants. Elmer Harmon died in prison in 1994 at the age of 76. Living under a new identity, Mary agreed to give a single interview. "People remember the horror, the shock, the disturbing details," she said. "What they don't see are the lives that continued afterward, the children who survived, the grandchildren who were born, how some of us managed to find some peace despite everything." Mary revealed that she considered the scientific work a way to give meaning to her family's suffering. "If something good can come from this terrible story, it's the knowledge that will help other people. Each discovery they make using our DNA is a small victory against the evil that Elmer represented." In the early 2000s, with the advancement of the Human Genome Project, the Harmon Project entered a new phase. Researchers managed to map with unprecedented precision the multiple mutations present in the lineage, creating the most complete map of extreme human inbreeding ever documented. One fascinating aspect was the identification of resilience genes, rare genetic variants that seem to confer certain protection against the most devastating effects of consanguinity. Martha Harmon presented several of these protective variants, partially explaining how she lived to 74 years despite being a product of multiple generations of consanguineous marriages. Today, more than half a century after the initial discovery, the legacy of the case continues to reverberate in both science and culture. The descendants of the family are scattered, many living without knowledge of their origin, others actively involved in efforts to break the cycle of isolation and destructive practices. Ruth eventually found some stability in a specialized institution. Although she never managed to live completely independently, she developed remarkable artistic skills. Her paintings, intense, emotional, and often disturbing, were exhibited in various galleries. She died peacefully in 2011 at the age of 59. The twins lived to 30 years old, far beyond initial medical expectations. Mary's baby grew up with loving adoptive parents and managed to lead a largely normal life. Today, this person has knowledge of his origin and occasionally participates in voluntary genetic studies. The original family property remained abandoned for decades. In 1997, a fire destroyed the main house, leaving only stone foundations and chimneys as silent reminders. In 2005, the land was transformed into an environmental preservation area with no mention of its dark history. For genetic science, the Harmon case represented a watershed. For society, the story remains a powerful reminder of the dangers of extreme isolation and the importance of effective protection systems for the most vulnerable. As Dr. Thompson reflected before retiring, the story of the Harmons is about how human beings can create alternative realities that justify the most destructive practices. But it is also about resilience, about how some people, even emerging from the most horrible circumstances imaginable, can still find some measure of peace and meaning. If you watched this far, it's because you like this story. Leave a comment saying, "I watched this far," so I can get to know you and find out who really enjoys the stories on this channel. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss our next investigations into real cases that history tried to hide. Leave your like so we can reach more people interested in these impactful historical accounts, and share with friends who appreciate documentaries about real cases that challenge our understanding of human nature.